let's talk about the outsider game, then we'll talk about the insider game.
Sure. I mean, well, I think that in some ways it's impossible to imagine the role that a movement can play if it doesn't involve insiders and outsiders, because a movement plays off of itself, right? It is a broad movement. So in terms of the climate movement, you have both activists who are going to work inside and lobby and work hard to put pressure from the inside on policymakers through the political system. And that is, as lobbyists, as folks who are, constituents, but then they also put pressure on the outside. And so in the book, what I talk about is what we call, the radical flank. And I'm using my air quotes here because this radical flank that we're seeing in the climate movement, as much as people are getting upset about, degradable paint being poured on Stonehenge or soup being thrown on a covering of it, a famous work of art, this is not particularly radical in comparison to previous social movements where their buildings were blown up and facilities.
People forget, like in the 80s, there was something like, 55 bombings over the course of that decade, maybe more.
Yeah. I mean, and if we think back even during the period, the height of the women's, struggle for women's suffrage, a building was blown up a month. I mean, and that's when people died, right? And now we're talking about throwing a little tomato soup. I mean, and it's not that I'm saying you should destroy art. No artwork has been destroyed thus far.
Right.
So, so there's that. So anyway, I talk about the radical flank, which is the component of the climate movement that is expanding to try to draw more attention to the issue. And that is a very common progression in a social movement when a social movement hasn't achieved its goals. I mean, either a movement dies out because people just give up and they go back to doing something else, or, and in this case, the world is warming and we're personally experiencing more and more climate, shocks every day. So that's not going to happen. Instead, we see more and more people getting fed up with going through this insider type of activism and taking to the streets and engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience. And in it, as I talk about in the book, we see right now groups that are using performative protest. That's the soup throwers, the paint throwers, the crazy gluers, the people who do the slow walking. We're seeing a lot of it around Citibank right now in New York City, with people blocking Citibank's entrance and other banks that are investing in fossil fuel extraction. These are very performative acts of nonviolent civil disobedience to draw attention to the climate crisis. We also see groups that are what I call disruptors in the book, and those are groups that are engaging in broader campaigns where they're working as insiders, they're working to get banks to move money, they're working as personal investors, but then they do these moments of nonviolent civil disobedience so they can draw attention to this broader campaign. And both of those are necessary components of the climate movement right now. And as I talk about in the book, that will continue to expand as more and more people feel the effects of the climate crisis. When they feel it firsthand, people are going to put pressure on, powers that be, both at the local level, at the national level, theoretically at the international level, although that's a lot harder to imagine how that will work. And that's all going to be needed for the kinds of systemic changes to happen that are needed.
What has to be done in terms of contextualizing that experience so that people know that what they're experiencing is a function of climate change, right? I mean, this is a problem, analogous to tell the government to get their hands off my Medicare. Like there's not necessarily a one-to-one understanding, because it's, it increases the severity of storms. It increases the likelihood of storms. It's a little bit more abstract than, say, a street corner where 10 people have been hit by a car. We need to change the traffic pattern there.
Right. I mean, you're absolutely right. So the climate crisis basically is exacerbating normal weather patterns, right? So we see more drought, more floods, more tornadoes, more severe everything, right? We're seeing more severe hurricanes, and we're seeing them more severe in terms not of the wind, which is how hurricanes are measured, but rather in terms of the amount of water that falls, because hurricanes are going over climate change exacerbated heated waters, right? In terms of the sea surface temperature. And that means that the hurricanes suck up more warm water and they have more water to rain down on. So we're seeing that too. So it makes it harder to understand it. And there's also been a misinformation campaign that's been leveraged by companies that are associated with fossil fuel interests to try to make it a little harder to understand that. I mean, it's pretty easy to say this hurricane is so much worse because the water in the Gulf is so much warmer than it's supposed to be. And that means that X amount of water is falling more than we would normally expect. I mean, it's still somewhat abstract, but I don't think it's that hard to understand. I mean, everybody's experiencing how much warmer it is. Just look at the map today. I mean, I just was looking at the New York Times this morning, and you can just see the whole map, and just everything's red.
No,
That's not really normal.
This summer it has not relented in New York. Usually what you get for 2 or 3 weeks, maybe, or 2 weeks or a week has been, I think we're on like week 8 now.
Yeah, and it's why they're calling it the summer of heat, right? And we're just in the beginning of August, so it's just going to continue. And the hurricanes, we're about to hit where hurricanes really start to get us.
Is there a cohort that needs to be activated? Is there a specific cohort? Because I mean, we could say, okay, it's not hard to understand that warmer waters create warmer storms. I would argue that, like, for a lot of people, it is harder to understand than it might be for, the people listening to our conversation and us. People don't know, there's a lot of things that people don't know. Also, there's not just, to beat my analogy up a little bit, it's not just a question of like the car hitting people. Maybe people can understand that dynamic, but they don't necessarily understand like the relationship, what's going on building the car. Like, where did the car come from? Like the man-made portion, right? Because we've seen the right, at least in this country, go from there is no climate change to, well, there's climate change, but that's God. And God does it, and God will, will step in and it'll change. Like, it's not man-made, that type of thing. And then if there is, well, maybe it was man-made, but man can't do anything about it. Like, is there a cohort out there? Like, how much of the society do we need to change the dynamic so that Kamala Harris can say, I'm going to stick with that fracking ban?
Well, so that's a great question. So I would just say that what we really need is there to be this critical mass that's putting pressure on politicians in power or politicians running for office that empowers them to step up to fossil fuel interests and give them the capacity to believe that they're not going to lose power if they make these decisions. I mean, one of the biggest challenges here is the timeline of addressing climate change is not the same. It's not 4 years, right? It's not the period of time that somebody is in the presidency. It's not 2 years, the amount of time somebody is in a congressional office. However, starting to build a fossil fuel, infrastructure like the Willow Project or something, you can actually put money into that, and your constituents will see that today. Whereas if Kamala Harris decides to do a fracking ban, there is going to be a period of time where people are going to lose jobs, lose money, worry that they're not going to have enough natural resources to run, the air conditioning or the heat, depending on where you live. Although more and more the air conditioning over the heat, of course, right? And so given that, there needs to be enough people to push back against that. And one of the things I would just say that I think is really interesting is that young people across the board are concerned about the climate crisis. In fact, there are a bunch of groups that, a handful of groups of young conservatives who are concerned about the climate crisis, who spent most of the Republican National Convention walking around trying to find somebody to talk to about climate change, because all of the people who are running the party over there are like, climate change isn't happening, et cetera, like you were talking about. But young people care about this. And one of the things that we know is that they feel very anxious about the climate crisis and worried for their future. And we saw that during 2019, 2020, until the pandemic stopped us. We saw that it really was pushing lots of young people to get politically active. What we really need is for those young people not to feel, anxious. I mean, and anxiety is a natural component of the climate crisis for sure, and a natural emotion for people to feel. We need them to feel angry. When people feel angry, they have this sense of efficacy and they feel like they can do something about it. And the more people feel angry about this issue and are willing to vote on it, not say they're not going to vote, because not voting basically takes you out of the entire process, right? So you don't get a say. But if you say you're going to vote against somebody if they're not going to ban fracking, that actually could matter. And that's the kind of political power that's needed and the pressure that's needed from the citizenry, from civil society. I don't know that that will happen, though, until we experience many more climate shocks where many more people become unhoused and, really feel the effects of the climate crisis firsthand.
But is electoral, like an electoral strategy like that, A, effective, and B, well, I think you would argue it's probably insufficient, but is it effective? Because we can say we're not going to vote for Kamala Harris because she's walked back on the fracking ban. But the reality is, I mean, in this instance, RFK sadly is also has said that climate change is just really, he's a conservationist of sorts, but his climate change for him apparently is just a mechanism for authoritarian control. And Donald Trump has basically said, the EPA is going to be outlawed from using the words. I mean, so I'm not clear where the electoral strategy, the electoral leverage is there, A. But B, if 18 to 34-year-olds are already there, maybe their attitude towards this, they feel disempowered, so they don't have the proper sort of perspective. They need to be angry instead of like the anxiety that comes with a certain amount of fatalism. What's the cohort that either A, feels empowered or is empowered? I mean, because if I had a choice between I want to mobilize 500,000 18 to 34-year-olds, let's say, versus I've got every one of the board of directors of ExxonMobil who are going to do what I say, I would take the latter in that instance because they control the levers in a way that, but I imagine the answer has got to be somewhere in between those.
It absolutely is. Well, I was just saying, so here's it. I mean, first and foremost, the board of directors of ExxonMobil are never, ever going to agree to phase out.
No, I know
okay,
that.
So
that was a complete. I was a complete.
It's really important to say it. So we cannot have faith in these fossil fuel interests, even if they say they're going to do stuff, because so many of them have backtracked on their commitments in the past year or two. Okay, and what I would just also say that my example around young people and supporting electoral politics is actually to point out. So young people don't tend to vote, and young people need to vote. And I am absolutely not saying that they should not support Kamala Harris. I'm saying they should support Kamala Harris, but they should also be pushing her to be as aggressive as she can be to address these issues, right? So she historically has supported a Green New Deal. She historically supported a fracking ban. Will they be able to get that by asking her to do it during the 2024 election? Absolutely not. But I think constituents who vote, who say that, is part of the solution. The other part of the solution, as I talk about in the book, is that what we're going to have to see is many more people, and that's working as insiders, right? To go back to what we were saying before. But we also need people working as outsiders and playing a role in putting pressure on these power brokers and people in power to recognize that they are going to lose legitimacy if they don't take a stand and push for systemic change. And that's something that I think, and as I talk about in the book, is going to only come with more pain and suffering, because otherwise business as usual always wins, and we're going to see it continue to win. And we're going to see it push on progressive candidates to become more mainstream, because we see the deck is stacked against the general public and against addressing the climate crisis because of so many resources in the pockets and in the hands of fossil fuel interests.
Are there interests that we take for granted, and I think it's a safe assumption, that ExxonMobil and entities like that, they're always going to be on the wrong side of this? They're impossible. It's impossible for them to do anything otherwise. Is there a cohort of industry or individuals or populations that are sort of 50-50, make a little bit of money from fossil fuel, but we could make more from this other thing? And maybe if fossil fuel becomes that much more problematic, not in terms of like what the studies say, but rather in terms of our bottom line, whatever that bottom line is, politically, economically, or financially, just socially, Where's that cohort?
Well, I would just say that, so what we see right now is that there are numerous clean energy companies, right? Companies that are making a profit off of battery storage, expansion of clean energy, wind energy, that do have capacity like you're talking about. But in a lot of places, those companies are actually fossil fuel companies, or components of fossil fuel companies, right? That are expanding out wind energy in Ohio, wind energy in Texas. And when they're embedded in part of this broader kind of fossil fuel mix, it's very hard to take a stand one against the other. I can imagine a world in which, for example, if fossil fuel subsidies no longer existed in this country, a lot of folks on boards of directors for energy companies broadly might say, hey, it's actually a lot more profitable for us to be investing in clean energy versus the dirty energy. But right now, with subsidies being what they are, it doesn't really work out that way. But that could change. And that could be something that a president could do.
So it seems like the idea is that in addition to people having a greater awareness and attempting to exert political pressure within the inside game, the outside game has to increase, while simultaneously, essentially, it's almost like an accelerationist argument on some level. Things are just got to be worse, but those who are advocating for this systemic change need to be in the game. So when those things happen, they are both interpreted and acted upon in a way that is much quicker than would otherwise be.
I think that's true. I mean, actually, a number of climate groups and different social movement organizations that work around climate change are starting to set up, like, basically programs where they're having people sign up for doing, being available when disaster hits in your community, to start to shine a light on the way that both we need to build back in a more resilient way that is aware of the kind of, crisis that we're in and the types of shocks that we're probably going to experience, but also take those moments to shine a light on the way that the climate crisis and fossil fuel extraction, fossil fuel consumption is leading to the problem. And I think that that's absolutely necessary. I mean, we know that we are all going to be hit with a lot more climate shocks before we address the problem sufficiently. That's unfortunate, but that is just the truth. So it's really about preparing to change the narrative, because right now the narrative really doesn't go there. It's very hard to get a lot of meteorologists to talk about the way that climate change is playing a role in these problems and these events, right?
Are there organizations that you think are doing this better than others? I mean, for the sake of people listening, if they wanted to get involved in these organizations, from ones that have the more radical tactics, because I don't think the ideas are necessarily radical as much as, within the context of our society, the tactics in certain instances, like the ideas associated with putting paint on a statue, or tomato soup on a statue is, I guess, outside the norm of polite conversation. But I get,
as my research shows, nobody is talking about blowing up pipelines right now. Nobody. So this is not about radical violent tactics. This is maybe radical, radical in terms of performative radical tactics to get attention, right? And the whole idea is for it to help to increase what we call salience, right? Climate salience in the media. So we talk about it more. So more people think about it and draw the lines between the crazy heat wave we're experiencing, or the drought we're experiencing, or the way that the hurricane is going to devastate Savannah, Georgia, all of those things, and connect the dots, right? That's the reason they're doing it. With regard to groups that are doing a really good job, I would just say that I think that there's some interesting organizing taking place by Sunrise, the Sunrise movement, which has these really, really impressive locally embedded hubs that take place, that exist all over the country and a lot of campuses. On my campus, on American University's campus, we have a wonderful hub. I think they're doing a really interesting job. The Green New Deal Network has done some really interesting work, and they do work where they both work as outsiders, but they also are connected with elected officials and working there to think about how to capitalize on shocks when shocks happen, to And basically the idea that, we know that windows of opportunity open after disaster. And the idea is, how do you take advantage of that to transition us to a cleaner, better future? So I think those are two groups that are working like as outsiders, but, very much in an embedded way in communities.
And groups like Extinction Rebellion, who are doing more, it seems to me like a lot of that performative, so-called performative protests.
Well, Extinction Rebellion in New York City has been doing a lot of that. We're going to see, there's going to be a cello concert in front of Citibank on Thursday, which is brought to you by a coalition of groups, including Extinction Rebellion. I mean, also Climate Defiance, which has gotten attention for bird dogging elected officials and, leaders of different banks and fossil fuel companies. They're doing some really interesting work as well. So those are all these outsiders that are getting a lot of attention. I also think we need to talk about Third Act in there. They're the Rocking Chair Rebellion. That's Bill McKibben's group. And they are doing some really interesting work that's both insider and outsider. They're working on drawing attention to the way that banks are investing in fossil fuel expansion while also using nonviolent civil disobedience in a really performative way. They have these beautiful, hand-painted rocking chairs that they sit in and rock in front of the entrance to a bank, so you can't really get inside. So, I mean, there are so many of them. And one of the things that my research has documented is how there is this, many flowers bloom kind of approach where all these different groups are springing up. And we're going to see so many more because as disaster hits, people start to form associations and start to think together and build these collectives to address the problem. And they do it at the local level, which is exactly where the problems are happening and where we need to start. But it obviously has to scale up to have the effects that are needed.
All right, we're going to put links to all of those groups in our website. And just lastly, you write about these actions are sometimes unpopular on their face, but do we have data that show that they are actually effective long term?
Well, we do know. So more research is needed, and unfortunately, I am constantly saying this. If you're interested in that, I wrote a piece in Nature magazine that came out in November that specifically talks about all the research that's still needed. But what we do know is it actually, to date, the radical.
You're breaking up just a bit. Me? Yeah, now we can. All right, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Nope.
What I was going to say is the research on the radical flank has documented the way that while the groups that are doing these kinds of tactics are not popular, they never have been popular. If you look back to the civil rights period, groups that were engaging in radical tactics then were not popular. However, what they do is they draw attention to the issue and they draw support for more moderate factions of the movement. And the research that has actually looked at actual climate activism documents that exact process is happening now. There are other folks who have done more abstract research, not on specific actions with a specific people who have experienced the activism, and they have come to differing conclusions, but the work that's gone into peer review actually does show that quite substantially. We need to do more research, but as a social scientist, I always have to say that. But it's true. We could get a lot more if we did more tailored research.
Dana Fisher, Director of the Center for Environment, Community and Equity, and Professor at the School of International Service at American University. The book is Saving Ourselves from Climate Shocks to Climate Action. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm and in our podcast and YouTube descriptions, as well as a list of those organizations if folks want to get involved in that now. And to the extent that we have research, it's encouraging that the groups themselves may not be popular, but you're not trying to win a popularity contest. You're trying to create social change. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.